Okay, everyone. So we might kick off. Welcome. My name is Leah Smith, and I'm the curator of programs and learning at the Biennale of Sydney. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today, and it's so nice actually to see you all in the one spot. I mean, we were divided a moment ago. We didn't really want to give sort of too much away. We thought it was important to situate ourselves in the landscape and to enable people to sort of just take their time to ground. Our warmest thanks to Terry for such a beautiful acknowledgement of country. But before we begin, I too would like to acknowledge the many different countries that we've come from and travelled through in our arrival to this place. I might actually need someone to let me know whether we are still in Gadigal or if we've moved into Darug land now. No, well, I'm going to acknowledge both. The Gadigal and Darug elders, the traditional custodians of land, sea and sky country, who have enabled us to be able to, still be in this environment with such care, and to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends joining us here today. It's so nice to see you, not just, through the Biennale, but also in this current moment. It's so important to come together. Finally, just a moment to offer a sincere thank you to our friends at the Australia Council for the Arts, Create New South Wales and the City of Sydney for making Rivers possible, and to the University of Melbourne for so generously supporting River Conversations. The 23rd Biennale of Sydney is here and open to the public from the 12th of March to the 13th of June 2022. And River Conversation sits at the middle point. It's the juncture, and so it's a really important moment in our programming calendar. I'm delighted to be here to actually realise River Conversations. It's a program that's been sort of in ideation and development for over a year with my dear friends and colleagues, Erin O'Donnell, who is a water law and policy specialist from the University of Melbourne, and Alessandro Pelizzon, just down over here, who is a legal anthologist from Southern Cross University, and outwards into the First Nations communities that they learn from and work with to reimagine our relationships and connections to rivers, waters and country. The development of this embodied symposium has been shaped by conversations ignited by the exhibition, questions around the possibilities, limitations and implications of acknowledging rivers as having legal rights, enabling the river and the communities that care and represent the river to sue those who exploit and inflict harm onto our rivers and the systems and the ecologies it supports. So some of the questions that really guided our thinking in developing this two-day symposium were, what does it mean to give voice to the river? How can we communicate with rather than for the river? How can we acknowledge rivers as ancestral beings? And what are the social, environmental and legal implications of providing a river legal personhood? So today we open River Conversations in the right way, on a boat, on the water, down the Parramatta River. We are honoured to be in the company of Leanne Tobin, a multidisciplinary artist of Irish, English and Aboriginal heritage, descending from the Burraburrung and the Romali clans of the Darug Nation, just over here, and Bradley Mugridge, a proud Moori from the Kamilaroi Nation, just towards the back over here. Final notes, this is not a regular symposium. It was our aim all along for River Conversations to be participatory, to be felt, to be experienced, and to offer our facilitators, caretakers, activists, and knowledge holders the freedom to communicate with their river and for their river in whatever way felt right. Thus, River Conversations will feature film, storytelling, poetry, conversation, and writing activities to bring the public into an intimate relationship and dialogue with our diverse speakers. So thank you so much for bringing your cultural selves to this space. We are so delighted to have you here. And now I have the pleasure of handing you over to Erin O'Donnell. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you to all of you for coming out today. I'd like to start by saying a really big good morning to everyone, but also a big good morning to the Parramatta River. I'm really looking forward to spending time with this river, in conversation with this river. And I think I'd like to invite all of you to think about the rivers and the water landscapes that are special to you and how you're going to carry this sense of rivers as living beings that you can be and are in conversation with as you go on from here, and take that feeling back to the rivers that you know and love, and start to become in conversation with those rivers as we move through. I'm going to say thank you particularly to the Biennale for hosting this incredible event. As legal scholars, Alessandro and I are really excited by all of these extraordinary legal developments around the world, and there are hundreds of them now, recognising the rights of nature. But this is a conversation that belongs with people. This is not just an academic theoretical exercise. This is about how all of us construct and carry our relationship with rivers. And so over the next couple of days, we're going to be using the idea of the river to carry us through this conversation over multiple parts of those days, starting today with the river and with you all here, and then moving through tomorrow as well. And we'll be using the idea of the river to help guide us. So today we're going to be starting with the idea of the river source as a main theme. Tomorrow that's going to be carried through with the idea of river tributaries and the contributions that they bring to the river. And then tomorrow afternoon we'll be finishing with the theme of the river mouth and what happens when everything starts coming together at the end of the river. So before I introduce Leanne, I'm just going to read a short passage to give you a bit of a sense of the themes that will guide today. Rivers are marked in the collective imagination by their bounded physical nature. Their journey from the source to the sea is visible and navigable, tactile and fluid. Yet, notwithstanding the clear demarcation of their riparian abode, the physical relatedness of rivers to the human worlds has, over the last few centuries, been transformed and commodified. Once the embodied representation of ancestral deities carefully paid attention to, rivers have now become sources of water for a variety of purposes, from agriculture to drinking water to industry, avenues of communication along which commerce and trade could unfold, boundaries, both between cities and within cities themselves. I think we've all heard of the wrong side of the river, much like the wrong side of the tracks. And sometimes just open waste disposals. Rivers have been seen as a means of transporting waste, human waste, out of cities. Many a river in a modern city is now seen not as the artery from which the life of the city itself once emerged, but rather as a dangerous and polluted fissure in the ordered fabric of the urban plan. And therein lies the paradox, the tension between the ultimate physical interconnectedness between rivers and the social life they empower, and the ideological disconnectedness between modern, mostly urban societies and their watery origins. The source of this journey is thus an invitation to rediscover rivers, rather than mere urban features, as veritable relations. I'll just let you sit with that for a moment. Before I introduce Leanne, I'm also going to recognise that we do have a Q&A session as the final stop for today. So as we hear the artists talk, if you've got a really burning question, then I guess feel free to put up your hand and ask it. But if you can hold questions until that Q&A session at the end, that would be wonderful. Now I'm going to welcome Leanne. She's a multidisciplinary artist of Irish, English and Aboriginal heritage, descending from the Burburong and Woomeli clans of the Darug, the traditional Aboriginal people of the Greater Sydney region. Leanne works collaboratively with community groups, local schools and institutions, using her art to tell local stories and to evoke an environmental conscience and respect towards the land and its original people. Her art practice seeks to encourage an open and honest dialogue about the past and to nurture respect and care for country, paying homage to our old people and their legacy. Leanne, over to you.
Didrigal. Warrami Midigar, that's Darug for welcome friends. I want to firstly acknowledge the saltwater clans of the Sydney region. I'm actually a freshwater person, so this connection is actually a beautiful thing, from the saltwater to the freshwater, the Parramatta River. which is very much part of our family story. I want to acknowledge also elders past and present and emerging, and other people who are here with good spirit. And I want to also acknowledge my mother who came along today, and she's very shy, so... And I'm very proud to have her here because her story is very much connected to Parramatta. She was born on the banks of the Parramatta River. She was born in a terrace house, and I only explained to Mum recently that the reason she was in a terrace house with midwives and many others were born there was because at that time the White Australia policy didn't allow Aboriginal women to give birth in hospitals, so Mum was born in a terrace house. And so she's, yeah, we're learning all the time. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm not a huge knowledge holder. I am on a journey of learning myself, constantly asking and learning and observing. And it's ironic that I'm now talking to people because really as a visual artist you don't ever sort of picture yourself standing up talking about your paintings and your art and your practice. Well, I didn't when I started because it really became a way for me to convey really big messages I had because I've always had an environmental conscience, and I think my dad actually, the Irish in my father, used to take me painting when I was only 3, open air painting, and that instilled a passion for the bush and everything green and watery, and from that it's grown into something bigger. I became a primary teacher in another life. I don't do that so much now, but that role as a primary teacher, my first job took me to Kakadu National Park. I just went in and answered an ad when I was unemployed for a year in Brisbane. So I just wandered up to Brisbane because my friends were there and walked in, applied, and then next thing I was 3.5 years in Kakadu. And I went up there to teach, but to be honest, I became a student up there. I learned so much. It just took me to another place, and I've got a beautiful connection now where the children I was teaching at the time and who were teaching me are now tribal elders up there, and they've just had their township handed over to them from Ranger Uranium Mine, and they are now the traditional elders that their journey. I'm in communication with one of them. I met up with Shelley Morris at the opening out at ICE, and she was stolen generation, but her brother and sister I taught up in Kakadu. So it was like these weird little things that happened with my life that, you know, I just handed over. I've learned a long time ago to surrender, to just release things and to have no expectations, and things come. And so I guess that's with the eels. I never thought I'd be on such a long journey with the eels, but this is how it's turned out. I want to sort of set the scene about how it once would have looked here, because it's really, really hard. And I know that when I started this journey, I started to disassemble all the buildings and take away the roads and the power lines, and you suddenly see the sandstone, you see the basalt, you see the trees, the variation of vegetation in different areas, pockets of different vegetation. And so you've got this salt water and then freshwater creeks and little springs that would spring up, and all around those waterways people lived, traditional, peaceful coexistence with the land, and they understood it and they knew that they had a role to protect it. And I guess in my capacity now as a Darug person, coming into that role of awakening other people as I'm learning things, I feel a really strong sense of responsibility. And I remember when I was in Kakadu, that was when I found out about my Aboriginality. I never knew, because Mum's mother, my nan, kept a secret, because it was a dangerous time in Parramatta to grow up as an Aboriginal person. And they were surrounded by family who all knew their Aboriginality, but no one ever talked about it. It was just, once we were at a stage where they could pass as white, that's what happened to protect their children. You know, I like to talk about this because a lot of people don't understand that, and they look up, oh, she's not Aboriginal, what the hell she talk? I want to talk about those things because that is part of Sydney's story of what happened and that interruption. I've been working in jails as well with Aboriginal people, male and female, and the biggest thing was the disconnection that a lot of people felt in the jails. And so I used to go in as an artist, because this is what I've learned too with my art practice, is to try and connect with country and my story and my past through my art. And I used to encourage that. You know, they don't have to do tokenistic Aboriginal art. Tell your personal story, because unfortunately, you being in that jail, that's part of Australian history, whether we like it or not. That's part of our dreaming. That's what's happened. And it needs to be acknowledged and recognised before we can move on. Anyway, I guess I'm moving around. There's such a big story around all this, but the river story, you know, when you look around, you can just imagine this whole place as its natural environment. It would have been so beautiful. There would have been little naois, little canoes, bark canoes in the water, people fishing from those canoes with fishing lines, little piles of sand in the middle there where they'd have a little fire and they'd cook their fish on the fire there. It was such a different time. I can only imagine little fires being lit, little smoke areas, you didn't know where people were. And we had a connection with the saltwater people, our freshwater mob up there. I'm descended from Yarramundi. There's a suburb named Yarramundi now, but a place. But that was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And he was a Karaji who met with Governor Phillip and Watkin Tench out at Pittown Bottoms, out at Hawkesbury area. And there's a beautiful account that Tench writes about when they first met that really, you know, it's so personal, and you see the personalities of the people, which is not always the case when you read records and British records. But these ones were really poignant, you know, really touched me. They noticed things like Yarramundi's pock-marked face. He survived smallpox because 2/3 of the population here were wiped out by smallpox within 3 years of contact. People who had never even met whitefellas were dying, and there's a horrific account of people scattered along the Hawkesbury River and Broken Bay. Too many dying to be buried. And, you know, people who know Aboriginal way, that is just unheard of. That it explains the smashing of ritual connections, ceremony, families. And so small groups of people would be thrust together that, you know, weren't always, you know, they were bigger than that. They were then suddenly, a clan group or a family group of, say, 20 was suddenly 3 or 4 people. And then they had to learn to survive through that. And so they pushed to the fringes and somehow made it through, even with the massacres that occurred, many of them still not talked about. They're things that need to be talked about. And when people say, oh, you know, get over it, well, we're not over it. People are still going through things. We're still learning stuff. We're still finding out stuff. So I guess that's where my art's come into a role of being a storytelling device, so I can tell the stories of what's happened. And it's like quiet activism. I can paint a painting, I can create a sculptural piece, and I can put it over there, and then I invite people to come and look at that and take what they will from that. I don't have to hit them over the head with the wet end and say, you need to know about this. I want to invite people in to be part of that conversation, because I think it's important that you recognise this as Australian history, not just Aboriginal history. I went to school out at Western Sydney at Nepean High at Emu Plains. I didn't know anything about Aboriginal people, unbelievably devoid of anything. I learned about Blaxland, Wentworth, Lawson, Captain Cook, you know, the same old characters. But we didn't learn about Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson following Aboriginal walking tracks over those mountains. We didn't learn about, you know, down here on fresh saltwater, Bungaree, we learned about Flinders and the cat and the boat, but we didn't know about Bungaree, who accompanied Flinders all the way around Australia. So those missing pieces of our history, I have made it a point of putting it in. And I can only talk from my family perspective. I bring in Darug history because it's still relatively unknown, and a lot of angst, a lot of damage, a lot of sadness and anger, and, you know, a lot of torn apart situations where people don't understand because we haven't sat down and actually had deep listening. Sit there, listen and hear my family story. Let's hear your family story. When you start talking like that, you get to understand a bit more about people and you have a bit more empathy. So, back to the river. Sorry, I get a bit passionate. I want to talk about it. But I guess for us, and I know through my own childhood, I had more to do with the Durrubbin, the Hawkesbury River. And I swum in there. I've only swum in Parramatta River a little bit. Mum swum in the Parramatta River more than I have. And she'll tell me stories of her brothers actually making canoes out of corrugated iron and tin off the road, and of tar off the road, and just putting the ends together, going out on Parramatta River and fishing for eels, and then take them home. Mum would cook them up. Like, no, not you. Your mum, my nan. But, they say that we've lost all connection to traditional ways. Well, that is a contemporary way of still maintaining an old connection. And for me, the eels are still there. And I've used in my artwork in the Cutaway and also out at the ACE building, I use the analogy or the metaphor of us being those eels, being adaptable, resilient. We change colour. The thing about eels, the fascinating story of eels is they merge and they move between saltwater and freshwater. And I was only reading the other day because they took a long time to understand the sex of eels. They didn't know why they didn't, all the eels they'd found, they hadn't found female eels with eggs. They hadn't identified the body parts or the sex organs of those eels. And apparently what happens is they only mate once in their lifetime. And so at a certain time, don't know what signals it, they suddenly have this urge to head to the Coral Sea. All of the eels along the east coast move out of the rivers and they change. They become fat. Their mouths and anuses close. They seal off. They don't eat for the whole journey. They turn silver, ready to go to the sea. And that's the time when the Parramatta mob at Parramatta would sit down. That was big feast time. It was around autumn time too. All this big rain would have been part of that. You'd be looking at full moon, high tide. And at Parramatta, there's a big space there where the water drops down, and it's where freshwater, saltwater come together. And the eels would lie there in wait, and that was the time when they would signify all the mobs from everywhere, Wiradjuri mob, Durrawal, Dark and Young, all of them would come together and have a big feast on the eels at that time. And that was also a time of trading, exchange, marriage, all those things would happen. And, it's funny for me now because I know Parramatta pretty well, and my mum does too, although it's changing rapidly now. It's becoming something I can't recognise anymore, and we're trying to fight to just keep some of the white historical buildings, let alone anything else. But I think the more that we talk about those personal stories from place, the more people understand the importance of preserving those places. So it's probably why I do a lot of those sort of talks about connections to particular places. I go into schools and they'll say, oh, we want to do Aboriginal education. So, well, how about looking at the environment where you're living and work out the waterways near your school and look at what's going on around there, what animals are native to those areas. What can you do in your everyday to care for the environment, to protect those animals or to preserve them or to, encourage them. And it changes the way schools start thinking about things. They start to really look on a deeper level rather than just a tokenistic handprint or a boomerang painted up on NAIDOC Day. So frustrating. There's so much more that we need to learn. And I think that deep connection to country and that understanding that we are country, we are part of that country. Doesn't matter how much tar you put on the road, you can put shoes on your feet, you can put high-rise building. We're all connected to country. And I think once we start understanding that a little bit more, you start to appreciate the need to preserve and protect. And Parramatta River's a classic. Anyone who's lived around here knows that it's been an industrial wasteland. Mum was talking to me about the abattoirs and the oil refineries that, existed all the way along the rivers there. And, even in the Sydney area in the Circular Quay, the tank stream there. That was the first water, fresh water for those boats that came in. Within 2 years, they'd polluted that waterway. Like, that mentality has to change. The waterways are not a dumping ground. The waterways are actually life. They're our blood. They're things that we need to really be protecting. And I think traditional Aboriginal way was those waters were sacred places because they understood that connection, you know? They understand it. It's still important. So I guess it's a very hard thing to see in an urban environment how you can bring about some sort of change like that. But I think everyone can do little things that can just change and modify your imprint on the land. Anyway, I think I've talked enough. Thank you for listening, everybody. Didu Manu.
Thank you so much. And again, can you all put your hands together once more? Thank you. Now, I'll be very brief, but we decided throughout the course of the 3 sessions today, tomorrow, and tomorrow afternoon to intersperse the much more powerful presentations with very short readings from some of the documents, be them cases, civil society declarations, or pieces of legislation that have recognized rivers as either living entities, legal persons, or worthy of rights. And I want to begin with the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Rivers, a very recent piece of, a very recent civil society initiative inspired by the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, which was signed by thousands of participants in Bolivia, in Cochabamba in Bolivia in 2010. And so the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Rivers declares that all rivers are entitled to the fundamental rights set forth in this declaration, which arise from their very existence on our shared planet. Further declares that all rivers are living entities that possess legal standing in a court of law. Establishes that all rivers shall possess at minimum the following fundamental rights: the right to flow, the right to perform essential functions within its ecosystem, the right to be free from pollution, the right to feed and be fed by sustainable aquifers, the right to native biodiversity, the right to regeneration and restoration, and the right to maintain lateral and longitudinal connectivity. So we now take off again for a very short journey, and we'll stop at another location where we'll hand over to Bradley over there for the next presentation. Thank you.
Okay. I hope you've all been enjoying this wonderful leisurely trip up the beautiful Parramatta River. We would like to begin the second session for today, and so I'm going to introduce to you Bradley Mogridge. Brad is a proud Murri from the Kamilaroi Nation with over 25 years' experience in Aboriginal engagement, water and environmental science, working in applied research, policy development, regulation and project management. Brad is currently Associate Professor in Indigenous Water Science and part-time PhD candidate at the University of Canberra, and a personal friend of mine. Brad, it's wonderful to have you here with us today. I'm going to hand over. We may do this in a Q&A format, but we'll see how we roll. So come on down, Brad.
Yama, everyone. Just acknowledge country, acknowledge everyone that has turned up today and obviously joined us to listen to some of our stories and our journey. And, you know, it's quite fitting that we're on the Parramatta. Acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be on board with us, and obviously our supporters. And hopefully we can talk about some stories and listen to some stories. And I'll want to give you a bit of my journey about my connection to water. because it's very important to every Aboriginal person, and I suppose for everyone here, if you don't drink it, you die. So it's pretty important. So I have an email message I use in my signature. Still learning my language. Grew up knowing the rude words. As you know, a lot of our language was taken from us and Mum's generation. So, Ngaya Winninga Guway Gawulban Gunigal. And that means I listen and talk to the connected waters. So we're listening, we're dancing, we're singing the rivers all the time, and it's just part of who we are. And water is so important as part of that. And I grew up up the river. So we head up the Parramatta River, and then you work your way into Toongabbie Creek, and then I lived on Girraween Creek at Toongabbie. So it was a connection early with creeks and rivers. So the Girraween Creek used to flow behind our house and flow through Girraween industrial area, and obviously through the golf course I played a lot of golf at. And so I wasn't on country, but I had a connection to water. But we used to go back to country a lot as kids, and you just sort of took that for granted. But when you realise you get older, you find those places that you visited now these days why your uncles and aunties took you there. Similar story to you, Aunt. Mum's one of 14. They were born. Nan was born at a place called Yarraba, which is where the old people of sort of the Kamilaroi on our side families were born, and then they moved around a number of times because of water shortages. So water played a key part in our movement, and it was their lives were heavily controlled, as we know. And so, like, Nan would go into labour. Because grandfather was on the railways back in those days, and they lived in railway tents beside railway trains, train lines and things like that. So she would go into labour, jump on the mail train with the mail bags, go to Moree, and she couldn't go into the hospital. She had to give birth on the verandas with the Aboriginal midwives. Similar story, So it's they weren't allowed in the hospital. So McMaster's ward was the place that you can sort of look up. Toongabbie, even the name Toongabbie was, is a place by the water. So, the connection to that place. Growing up, used to play in the creeks, the Girraween Creek, guppies and tadpoles and frogs, and as kids do. But then you realise, some days that creek was milky, some day it was bright yellow because of the industrial area at Girraween, and then later in life, I end up working for the EPA, and then I was playing golf one day at Fox Hills, and the creek was this horrible yellow colour. And I went, hang on a sec, that doesn't look right. I remember seeing it when I was a kid, but just thought it was a normal part of river systems. And then I rang in to the environment line and made a complaint. EPA come out and they find it because it was a paint factory just dumping straight into the creek. So I suppose having that connection and that ability to then connect to waters and protect it. So I was a Murray with a big stick, which was fantastic. And I suppose the journey through my career is science has been my thing. It's been good to me. It's been bad to me. Some days I think, why the hell am I doing this? But days like this, I get to tell a story. I get to tell you, and obviously, hopefully, one day you'll encourage that next Aboriginal person to say, well, science could be an opportunity for you if you enjoy asking questions and then finding the answers to those questions. That's what a good scientist does. And then I think about how our old people were. I think I might have a bit of Italian in me too somewhere. I haven't found it yet in the genealogy, but it's definitely. I think that's just something to do with a hand. And so that science pathway, I did went to school at Greystanes, and then went on to Parramatta Marist Brothers, finished year 12, and that transition from year 10 to year 11, I was told I probably shouldn't do maths and science. Probably shouldn't do that. Okay. I said, all right, okay. But I want to do science. And then I did, I had to do, we called it maths in the garden. It was that basic maths. Counting, yeah. Maths in society, I think. I didn't even study at the HSC time, but I ended up doing geology and biology. I wasn't allowed to do physics because I couldn't do the higher maths, and got ducks of geology in the end. And I thought, I don't mind this science stuff. Yeah, this is cool. And so I went on to uni to do geology, and I loved learning about the Earth, and then thinking about the connection between our people's understanding of country and how it was formed, and then linking the dreaming stories and obviously how rivers are created, how rivers change and move. And then, even these days, we find that, some old people have stories that talk about old river paths. And then, Western scientists then go drill and they find riverine sediments. So it's a paleo channel. So those sort of stories are still strong. And that's the bit that I'd love to celebrate more, that I think bringing Indigenous knowledge to the forefront, and then to a point, getting to a point where it's validated. And there's so many examples of knowledge and our old people being scientists, the first scientists, science before science was a thing. Like the stories of Port Phillip Bay, when people had to move to higher country, when the sea level started to rise at the end of the last ice age. So 7,000 to 10,000 years old, that story is. That's told and retold. We're on the Parramatta here, and it's a flooded river valley, and you think 10,000 years ago we were way down there, and those people that used to live way down there had to move to higher country because of it was climate change back then. So we've survived climate change. We've adapted. We've even survived policy. We're still here. And I suppose the challenge for me too is then I did environmental science. I did geology. I thought I was looking for uranium in a national park in the Great Sandy Desert. So that didn't sit too well. So I come home back east and changed to environmental science, and so started heading down that way. And then my first job was at Blacktown City Council. And my mate, who used to be my caddy at golf, he was the director of environmental section. He said, yeah, there might be a job here. And there was new legislation around septic tanks, which is you've got to start at the bottom. Your job inspecting septic tanks and making sure that the septics were functioning well and weren't polluting and things like that. So I worked at Blacktown Council. I was on the and then worked at Camden Council. But then, I was on the Blacktown and Aboriginal Advisory Committee for a number of years, which was cool. Not as I was just more there to help, or give the committee and give the traditional owners some bullets to fire. You know what I mean? So, understanding the legislation and understanding policy and the science as well. We could, that's sort of my role when I'm not on country. I do that now. I'm on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. I live the dream, and I'm on Marbo Boulevard. That's a true story. True story. I can show you my licence. In the suburb of Bonner, so after Uncle Nev. And so Uncle Nev has a connection too, because in 1987 I went on I made the Australian Aboriginal golf side, and we went to Hawaii and played the native Hawaiians, and it was just magnificent. And then Uncle Nev was our patron, so big wily white hair, and he was a golfer as well, so it was really cool to have him. And rest his soul, Charlie Perkins pretty much funded our trip, back in that day. So, that was 1987, and nothing's happened since. So I suppose it'd be cool to reignite that golf community, and we're still all friends and golfing. So digressed a bit there, but hope no one owns a site at the Olympic Village. I went there before the Olympics. They built the village in full apparatus and breathing apparatus. That's where the Olympic Village is now. Yeah, so I suppose that's the history of a lot of our rivers, is that they were dumping grounds. And then thinking now about my country, I was there yesterday. I drove from Moree yesterday, so well travelled. The last 2 weeks, I think we've done, 5,000 kilometres. So I should have got frequent driver points. So yeah, last week I was on leave and flew to Alice. I was at the Parramatta Festival, the Light Festival, and it was on a panel there, and that was magnificent. It was a what do they call it? When you tick a box, the bucket list. Yeah, tick the bucket list. And I was on a panel with a young lass from Aranda country, and she's in climate change and that sort of space. So it was, and Rhoda Roberts was the convener. So and we had potoroos bouncing around us because we're in the desert park. It was quite amazing. And then as a family, then we drove to Uluru and then drove up to Darwin. So that was where the chunk of the driving was. And then being on country last week, we've got a project with Macquarie Uni, and we're looking at how we can get kids back on country from surrounding communities to talk about the Guida wetlands. The Guida wetlands are about 20% of its original size. A lot of our mob in Moree, it's only probably about 50 k's from Moree. A lot of our mob would not know it's there. They've been disconnected because it was all private land. And so it's come back into public land now, and it has, because our national parks have purchased a lot of the property. But you stand at the Guida River. You think about the Guida River. Can be a big river in places, but the channel that brings it in is probably, maybe from that TV to that. Maybe that counter there. So really, it's an irrigation channel. It's just there to deliver water for irrigation. So we're surrounded by heavy agriculture, so cotton, wheat, dry land, grazing as well. So, our country has changed a lot, and we're in the process of trying to build to a point where we have a say in that management. And I think science, I see part of my role is to use science to know the language of science, to know the language of policy and legislation, to then give to my elders things to say, things that you can say in a meeting that will prick up the ears of the decision makers. So, get to a point where we are decision makers about our own country. We've currently got a native title battle going at the moment. We've got 850 wells going in the Pilliga for coal seam gas. And, those challenges are non-stop. We can't say no. We don't have veto power to say no. We can't say no. So those are different. Took the boy up. He's up the back there, Kai. And we took, being on country is important. And that's what I did growing up. We used to go and we used to hunt with the uncles and fish. And, those sort of experiences I need to maintain as well. So, thinking about where the water is at the moment, like country is at its best at the moment. So we've had natural rain. So we've been pretty lucky. We got to see country in all its glory because it's wet. And, there was a lot of restrictions on where we go because we found out if you go to a wetland and it's wet, you can't go too far. So it's a tip for you there. But I think the thing is that we need our voice heard in the management of these special places. So, and as I said, science is a key way. There's so much knowledge that our old people have, and we've lost a lot. Some has gone to the grave, but there's still stories that are told and retold out there. And those stories are evidence. They are thousands of generations of observation of one's country that are told and retold. It's sung, they're in law, they're in dances, they're in part of song lines, they're in dreaming stories. And, our special place is Boobra Lagoon. And, the story of the Guttia carving its way through chasing the warrior back in the day. And it got to the bumble tree, which was the Guttia's, which was like a serpent with crocodile heads. So just imagine that beast. It stopped at the bumble tree because the bumble tree was the Gutier's mother-in-law, and then you don't mess with the mother-in-law, I think, in those days. So, and so the Gutty is still in, and we still heavily respect that lagoon of what it is. You know, the story that connects us to that place, and also the cultural significance. You know, we see it as the most culturally significant place. It's part of law. It's part of ceremony. You know, there's initiation places all around it, and then the connection it has to the rivers. You know, it's geomorphologically, it's an old river path that. But our story changes that because it also has connections underneath. You know, the Guttier uses a deep waterhole that connects to the McIntyre River. And that's how we know it's connected to groundwater. And that was my other sort of passion, is groundwater. So while I was in local government and inspecting septic tanks, losing pens into septic tanks, so yeah, sense of smell, yeah, maybe if I had COVID, I wouldn't be able to smell it or taste it. The connection to groundwater really got to me. Then I thought groundwater is something that is not celebrated or understood by Western science. And you know, I then did a master's just at UTS here at Broadway on Aboriginal people and groundwater. So I looked at the connection. I wanted to look at what connections Aboriginal people had. And I wanted to do it from New South Wales point of view, but there wasn't enough data. So to actually generate something. And so I just had a more general narrative around Aboriginal people's connection. So you looked at the dreaming stories, you know, the stories of, you know, missionaries and police and post officers that Aboriginal people talked about these groundwater places, and the explorers had. And I think then looked at the art. You look at Aboriginal art and it's strong. They're all based around, we're on the driest inhabited continent on Earth. And so water is a key part of what we paint and what we sing about and what we dance about. So, you know, that connection was strong. And then obviously the dreaming stories, and then you know, finding out that a lot of these groundwater sites were women's places. So I had to be really careful talking about some of these places and connecting to some of these places. And I think it's if I do the wrong thing, I know there's a rubber thong coming my way. You know, if I say the wrong thing, you know what I mean? So I need to be careful about talking about these places. But then understanding that groundwater knowledge in a dry landscape is not celebrated, that Aboriginal people have. It's not celebrated. It's not, you know, a lot of that survival is built in to, you know, when you think about the desert country, you know, if you didn't know where water was, you're not going to last too long. So that, you know, the amazing ability of those people that lived in the desert, you know, Australia's 70% semi-arid, that connection they had, the stories they had, the knowledge they had of groundwater, you know, is just not part of our celebration as a nation. So, you know, I see part of my journey is to build up that voice. I've been a member of the International Association of Hydrogeologists for 20 odd years now, and you know, 2019 the Australasian Groundwater Conference had its first Indigenous session, you know, so that had its first Indigenous specific session. So we had Anne Polina from the Martawarra Kimberley, and she talked about her connection to her river and also groundwater. And then we had a Maori lad come across from the South Island. They've got some charcoal drawings in limestone caves, and groundwater's fluctuating a lot, and it's moving up and down, and it's actually starting to erode some of the caves. And the charcoal drawings of their, I think it's the Taniwha, which is like their dreaming creator, as part of their genealogy and their stories. They're sort of like the, you know, the spirit that moved through the landscape. And, you know, there's amazing charcoal drawings of the Taniwha in these caves, and he talked about the management they're trying to stop the fluctuation in groundwater. I got to talk, and we had Alan Holt, who was on the Great Artesian Basin Community Committee as well. And then we had these one presentation with a hydrogeologist, and he's been working in the Great Sandy Desert with the TOs out there, and he had the Nurra Nuttara Women Rangers. He was working with them, he was part of working with Shell. I think they were mapping water holes, and the Nuttara Rangers were mapping water holes from a cultural point of view, and it was lining up together. So it was traditional knowledge and Western science coming together, which was a great opportunity. And then the Nuttara Rangers, 3 Aboriginal women, turned up from the Great Sandy Desert to Brisbane. We didn't know they were coming. They just turned up and said, "Oh, can we present or can we talk?" And so we found them tickets and then got them up. And they're all shy, and Steve presented his bit about the Western science, and then the 3 Nuttara Rangers got up and just spoke beautifully with passion, and they were telling stories about being on country and how proud they were of the ranger badge they were wearing, protecting their country. And those 3 women were just magnificent. And then at the end of the conference, they always have the best talk, best poster. They won the best presentation for the whole conference. So them just rocking up, telling their story with and talking about the connection between Western and traditional knowledge. Won the big gong for the conference. So our next conference is due, I think, this year in Perth. So we're going to have another Aboriginal session, which is great. And if there's Aboriginal stories and people involved in groundwater, we'd love to have it. And we're looking at trying to make sure that there's funds available to get people to Perth to present and be part of that. So obviously we want Aboriginal co-presenters or presenters, lead presenters, presenting their research. And then as I just quickly finish, got to finish soon. So I've been lucky enough to, thinking about rivers as well, so I've been lucky enough to co-edit 2 special editions, 2 journals. The first one was with Professor Sue Jackson, and that was the Australasian Journal of Environmental Management. And one of the papers from the Kimberley in a scientific journal, had an abstract written in language. That was a first. That's a big shift. And then the second one was I was co-editing with Dr. Gail Tipper, who's like the mother of cultural flows, from Ngāi Tahu in South Island in New Zealand. And we had New Zealand and Australian journals, and one of the journals again had Marawara, River of Life, as first author. So a real shift for journals. So those 2 special editions targeted Aboriginal people's connection and value of groundwater, so of water in general. So those two editions, have been magnificent to be part of, and I think it's sort of shifting the narrative. It's changing the way science thinks about Aboriginal knowledge, but also how knowledge can actually influence science to change the way we think about rivers and how we value rivers. Because, rivers in, say, west of the Divide here, they have an economic value. They have a dollar value. Water that is not used for irrigation or mining is wasted water. That's the value of water. So, we Aboriginal people want to change that narrative to talk about the value of water itself, shift that. And I think that's part of the journey we're on. So if anyone can help us, help a brother out. That'll do me.
Thank you, Brad. And insofar as the Italian potential heritage, like a Venetian uncle of mine always says that Italians very surreptitiously infiltrated and colonized the entire planet through the very subtle art of lovemaking. So that might be true. Thank you. Thank you. So in 1972, Professor Christopher Stone of the University of Southern California concluded a property law lecture with what was then and still is a very provocative question. Should trees have standing, he asked. Standing meaning the right to be represented, sue, and be sued in court. Now, what had prompted the question was the development of the proposed development of a ski resort by the Walt Disney Company in the southern part of the Sierra Mountain, in the Mineral King Valley. And the Sierra Club, the long-term protector of the area, launched an action to try and stop the development. And the action climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, which ruled against the Sierra Club, arguing that since the Sierra Club was not directly damaged by the proposed development, the Sierra Club had no standing. But, Professor Stone said, something is getting damaged. The entire old-growth forest that will be destroyed for this ski resort to be built, it will be damaged. And so if standing is the necessary prerequisite to be protected in a court of law, maybe standing should be given to the tree and granted to the trees. Now, notwithstanding the Supreme Court refusal to admit or accept this argument, the dissenting judgment by Justice Douglas in Sierra Club and Moreton still is to this day one of the probably most poetic pieces of, it's hard to think of, you know, a case being poetic, but nonetheless, one of the most poetic pieces of case law that has ever been written. He wrote, "Inanimate objects are sometimes parties in litigation. A ship has legal personality, a fiction found useful for maritime purposes. The ordinary corporation is a person for purposes of the adjudicatory processes. So it should be, as respects valleys, alpine meadows, rivers, lakes, estuaries, beaches, ridges, groves of trees, swampland, or even air that feels the destructive pressures of modern technology and modern life. The river, for example, is the living symbol of all that life it sustains or nourishes: fish, aquatic insects, water ouzels, otter, fisher, deer, elk, bear, and all other animals, including man, who are dependent on it or who enjoy it for its sight, its sound, or its life. The river as a plaintiff speaks for the ecological unit of life that is part of it. Those people who have a meaningful relation to that body of water, whether it be a fisherman, a canoeist, a zoologist, or a logger, must be able to speak for the values which the river represents and which are threatened with destruction. The voice of the inanimate object, therefore, should not be stilled. That does not mean that the judiciary takes over the managerial functions from the federal agency. It merely means that before those priceless valleys, alpine meadows, rivers, or lakes are forever lost or are so transformed as to be reduced to the eventual rubble of our urban environment, the voice of the existing beneficiaries of these environmental wonders should be heard. Perhaps they will not win. Perhaps the bulldozers of progress will plough under all the aesthetic wonders of this beautiful land. That, however, is not the present question. The sole question is, who has standing to be heard?
Back together for a Q&A session with our amazing artists. So if I can just get everybody to start coming back inside. If anybody wants to tap anyone on the shoulder outside at the front or up the top. If you've got any questions, I feel like it's going to be a challenge to make ourselves heard, but we'll do our best. Okay. So we'll just let a few more people start trickling down. I think the conversation so far today has been absolutely amazing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of you about any thoughts that the artists and contributors have inspired for you and what you might be taking back for your own rivers and your conversations with rivers. Staying away from the speaker. Okay, so I'm probably going to exercise my prerogative and ask the first question, but I really welcome anyone to put their hand up. You'll probably have to shout very loudly when you ask your question, because I think we've only got the one microphone, but feel free to come up and use it if that would be easier as well. So my first question to both Leanne and Brad is, we're talking about rivers being recognised in settler law, in coloniser law, as living entities. And so I wondered if you guys had some thoughts about what that means. In Aboriginal law, does it resonate with your relationship with the river? Do you see this as a good thing?
Absolutely. I mean, the river is a living entity, and it is alive. It's a live life, and it sustains life. So actually my cousin Julie Jones has got a poem at the moment representing the river, Parramatta, or Barangaroo as we know it, river up at the ACE building out at Parramatta there. And it actually talks to the audience as an entity. And it's a beautiful poem. She sent it to me. Of course, I've got a flat battery, so I couldn't read it today. But, you know, I thought I talked long enough anyway, but she actually took it on board and talks as the river because, as we know, the Parramatta River has gone through a lot. So it needs to have a voice, and, yeah, we see it as a living thing. I'm sure my brother here is going to say similar.
Yeah, I think it has strong connection because who in times when the river is abused, it's diverted, it's over-extracted, it's pushed to the brink of dying, who is its voice? There's no one to represent it, you know, and I think that's our modern day challenge is how can we be its voice? You know, how can we protect it and, you know, try and get it back to something to remotely what in all its glory, you know, and I think we have a responsibility to do that as well. You know, we're caretakers, we're custodians. You know, as I said, we sing it, we dance it, we have stories about it. You know, some of those stories as kids used to scare the shit out of us, but you know that had a reason. That had a job to scare us. You do not go to that water hole. The snake's in there. If you upset the snake, you're in trouble. So, you know, don't go there after dark. You know, you don't go to the river after dark because the trees that are leaning over will come down and grab you. You know, those sort of stories, the little hairy men that would, Bunyip was a strong one. And, you know, those sort of connections we have, I think we have to have a voice in its management. And, you know, whether that's the right of the river, we be part of that right, is still yet to be seen. You know, we've seen all the advancements in the Wanganui. It took them, 15 years to get to something. Yeah, 150 years. You know, we don't have a treaty, and I suppose that's why we don't have any veto powers. We don't have any say in management. We're always on advisory committees. We're always giving advice, and whether they take it or not, you know, that's the challenge. But I suppose if we start infiltrating the system through, you know, I suppose you've got to talk the language and to be part of that system, you know, and sometimes to be accepted, but with authority. You know, I'm only a young fella in culture as well, but you know, I'm going to be maybe a doctor soon. You know, and that, you know, I'm an arse pro, as my kids call me, associate professor.
Yeah, better explain it.
But I think you know, the challenge for us, for a lot of Aboriginal people that get to the chance to talk and be a voice and tell their story, you know, we do have a certain amount of privilege, and we need to make sure that we do it right as well, you know. And I think I was just saying to a lad before, I said, you know, if we do something wrong, the Aboriginal grapevine works faster than the NBN. You're stuffed. Yeah.
I might just add too, the river is actually having its way, and it has been having its way the last couple of months. People are seeing the force of water and the river and nature, and it's getting so loud you have to listen. You know, we can't go building there. And they were told out, I know, with the Durrubbin at the Hawkesbury River, they were told, do not build there. When they first moved out there and took over and possessed some of the country there, the local mob, our mob, actually said to them, you know, don't build there. They built there, they got flooded, and they've continued to build there. Like, I don't get that, but that's what they're doing. And I think, yeah, the voice is louder than ever, so they're going to have to listen.
I think that's a really important point. It's very easy to love rivers or to love nature in the abstract, but we are also witnessing the power of nature that as it pushes back against behaviours that it doesn't like, that are making it uncomfortable, that where we put ourselves into harm's way. So finding a narrative that lets us understand the scariness, as Brad was talking about, the stories that keep us safe, but also recognising that this doesn't mean that we can't love the rivers that we live along. They can damage us, and they are often damaged, but we also don't need them to be pristine in order to love them as well. And I think that's that story of remaining connected through time and change is also something that came through really strongly from both of your presentations today. Before I ask my next question, I'm just going to pause and see if anybody else wants to put their hand up. Oh, Charlotte. All right, I'll ask one question, I'll come to you. Excellent. So this idea of being present through time and change, we're in an extraordinary upheaval around the world. Climate change, the pandemic, many, many layers of challenge. And I think a lot of people are finding it really, really tough. There's climate grief, there's climate anxiety. A lot of white fellas and settler colonisers like me are looking for ways to try and make sense of that and think about it. And I think Aboriginal people, First Peoples around the world have a long history of persisting both through the colonisation changes, but also, as you've both talked about, through changing climates. And I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that resilience, how you make sense of those kinds of extraordinary changes.
I actually think that we need to get familiar and learn those old ways. Once upon a time, our people, and still it's practiced throughout other parts of Australia, I know this from when I was living up in Kakadu, and I actually caught on to identifying plants that signify changes, looking at the skies and seeing and being able to read weather patterns. Those were just innate in our people. And, down here in southern Australia, we've lost a lot of that. And that is something that we could be very wise to learn again, because that was old knowledge that is invaluable to everybody. And it's still there. Like I had an opportunity to take a group with a grant of 8 artists. We went out over a year. Every 2 months we would go to the same location and we would observe the changes, and we documented those changes through artworks, through written diaries, and looked at the animals around, the plants. Every single one of those artists, besides having an amazing array of artwork at the end, all have become observers, really close watchers of nature. And we see the changes. I drive up the mountains, up to the mountains, I can see when the yellow box is out in flower. I think, oh yeah, September, October time. Those changes, they're still there. We just got to switch onto it a bit more. And there's people who have those old knowledges still around. We need to learn from those people too. That's my... You forgot the original question?
Yeah, what you said was good. No, I think I was lucky enough to be a contributor to Working Group 2 Doc for the IPCC, latest IPCC report. So there was 3 of us invited to be contributors, not lead authors. So it's probably the first time that Indigenous people were contributors. There was a Sami lead author in one of the chapters, Tero Mustonen, I think his name is. And he's from Finland, and he was a lead author, so it's a first. But we still haven't made it into the science part of IPCC docs, AR, what are we at, AR6. So hopefully AR7 will have Indigenous lead authors, because if the lead authors don't invite Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous people to be contributors, then Indigenous voices miss altogether. So sitting around with it was 2 women, one was Torres Strait, hearing her stories that that as Peter Dutton laughed, giggled about, seas lapping at doors, their country has been taken. They're going to be refugees soon. Their countries are being taken by the sea, and they've got their ancestors being exhumed because graves are popping up and they're losing country. And, that's real, and they're sort of saying time for mitigation's over. It's time to adapt now. No more time. The time is lost for mitigation. So the challenge for us is talking about how we can influence decision makers around knowledge for climate change. And, like I was talking about earlier, the Parramatta being a river valley, flooded river valley. So, it has filled up over thousands of years as sea levels rose and fell. And same as, Port Phillip Bay and the Great Barrier Reef and a lot of islands off Australia have connections because you could, back when sea levels were low. So those people just adapted and got through it. And I think I might have said too, survival's built in. It's just built into our people that we can adapt to anything country throws at us, even legislation and policy, thinking about the challenges that, our old people had, how easy we've got it today, like just, Nan catching the mail train. There was no cars or no one to take her to the hospital and then having to give birth on the veranda rather than going into the hospital because they weren't allowed. And, me being born in the early 70s counted as a human. They weren't. That generation wasn't seen as human. And talking about those experiences for the next generation, they've got to understand too that fight has to come out. Like I don't see myself as one of the ones that march and rattle the spears and rattle the coat of arms at Parliament House. I see my role differently. I do it through seeking more knowledge to actually then influence the way we look at this continent. And I think rivers are a key point of that because it's without these rivers of life, their voice, we have to be their voice as well. And I think if we can influence that, we'll be a better place.
Thank you. Charlotte, would you like to come up and maybe try and speak into the microphone?
Okay. Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm come from Melbourne, and I'm the Yarra River Keeper. So, and that's the Birrarung is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung name for that river. So I've come up here to learn about the rivers up here, and it's fantastic that we've got this symposium that's happening over the next 2 days. My question is, we're an organisation that's been around for 18 years, but we're essentially a white organisation, and we work with the traditional owners along the Birrarung, and we're allies of them. But how can we be better allies? So how can white people be better allies in this fight for justice for rivers? And I'm particularly thinking about the Birrarung, and you might not be able to talk specific about that, but how can white organisations be better allies is the question.
Yeah, great question.
This is one I've actually, excuse me, this is one I've pondered myself as a teacher going into schools, and I immediately came up with that idea of, I always go into schools because kids are the future leaders. They're the ones who are going to be able to affect change. They're the ones who are going to feel the changes. It's harder to convince older people who are set in ways and don't want to move or to change. But I just felt it was really important, and as I mentioned when I was talking about understanding Aboriginal culture is directly connected with country. So, wherever you are, it doesn't matter where you are, it can be an urban environment. You can still start looking at where you are. That drain near your house, once upon a time, it was a creek or a river that people played, kids ran along, climbed in trees, fed or gathered yams from, or dug up around the banks of. They were living places, and we've seemed to have forgotten that. I remember when I first became aware of that, driving along freeways and looking down and seeing all these concreted culverts and drains and thinking, they were rivers. They're still rivers. It's just we have tried to capture them. And everywhere I look now, I can't help it. I see these caged rocks and think, oh, man, we've got to cage everything. You've got to lock it in. You've got to concrete it down. And we're losing that connection to the ground, to the putting your feet in the dirt or in the sand, that connection. And the more you remove yourself from it, the less you feel obliged or responsible to it. So I think, going into schools, getting kids aware of that, taking them out, the old-fashioned nature walk, go out for a walk around, have a look at where the trees are, why the sun's shining there, why is there moss on that side. Those sort of observations raise that awareness in kids and in adults, funnily enough. I've taken adults for nature walks too, they get into it. Because it's part of us. We are part of that. I think that detachment factor has got to be diminished.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's also changing the narrative, but also influencing the curricula as well. So making sure that Indigenous knowledge is a part of the curricula. So start early and all the way through to university level, that Indigenous knowledge can be part of that curricula. So, but I just wanted to go back to your original question. I just thought of two cool examples. So the understanding of climate and weather and knowledge and seasons, like at the moment we're under La Nina, and so it's a different cycle. And so the old people would have known that different cycle. We're under a different cycle because the emus are breeding twice. They only breed once. So that sort of indicator would have told them that, hang on a sec, this is different. And then, there might be plants flowering differently at this time of year as well. So as you said, just into this. So those sort of things are a key part of observing and knowing and understanding culture. And then back onto the curricular stuff, I've had the opportunity to help write some curricula for schools, and then we're indigenising the curricula at University of Canberra as well. So there's a pathway. I think Melbourne Uni's done some really cool stuff. University of Queensland is doing some really cool stuff in the space. So it's making that thing happen, but then also allowing, how do we support those kids that may have an interest in science or may have an interest, try and sway them away from the other big challenges that we have, like education, health and law, and, think about science as a career. How can we get them? I remember being at the Kimberley Ranger Forum on the Dampier Peninsula, another bucket list ticked. And a young fella, after the welcome, he said, I'm a ranger here on my country. I want to be a ranger leader. I want to lead my people, have that opportunity to get those. But I might need a Bachelor in Environmental Science, but I don't want to leave my country. He's probably in the remotest parts on the planet, away from a university or a teaching facility, and he doesn't want to leave his country. So how can education and university go to him? And other kids might see him. He's wearing the badge, and they think, I want to be a ranger too. So it's, we're like, he's doing studies now, and, he wants to be a ranger as well, but he's in a city like Canberra. So he has that opportunity to stay with his family and do that, but that young fella, he can't. So how can education change, and the way we deliver it as well, give them opportunity, and then the curricula starting early, having examples through the curricula, and it just becomes normal. It's just part of the curricula, it's changing that narrative, and then there has to be a bit of that truth telling as well. Those stories that don't get told. You talked about someone was talking about the tank stream. The tank stream. You don't get told that story that the Aboriginal people told them where the water was, and then they went and shit in it and dropped their rubbish in it, polluted it. So that and then now it's concreted. So that freshwater giver of life was treated that way. So those stories need to be told as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think that's also a note that I wanted to come back to Charlotte's question, and I think this is something for all of us to take away. How do we be better allies? And allies to rivers, allies to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Anyone of settler colonial heritage in Australia really owes that to Aboriginal people. I'm a member of the Birrarung Council, and we are the voice of the Birrarung, the Yarra River that Charlotte mentioned. One of the challenges that we are currently working through is, how do we give effect to the bicultural nature of the council? The council has Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders on it, as well as non-Indigenous people like me and others. How do we work together in a way that is genuinely new and not just a white fella system, that we've plonked Aboriginal elders down to be part of that. So we're trying to reshape the way we operate as a council. How do we bring in ceremony? How do we bring in a yarning style of communication rather than a boardroom style meeting? How do we be accomplices with Aboriginal people, not just allies, but active participants in the change that they wish to see? So I think that's, for me, that's probably one of the answers to Charlotte's question is, let's reframe allyship. Let's make it accomplice. If you're not in there getting your hands dirty alongside, under the leadership of Aboriginal people, then yeah, that's something to start aiming for.
Oh, wow. It's a big one. I think the hardest part is, I know with the Darug community, we're all so exhausted. We are just running from one thing to another and trying to put out spot fires, trying to be involved in as many things as possible. And a lot of our elders are really sick and getting, just exhausted. And I've had so many different things happen. And just recently I've had different groups ringing up, oh, we'd love you to present, we'd love you to come and talk. I was thinking, oh, look, as a reconciliation group, why don't you go to the Aboriginal organisations and see if they want help with their projects? Actually do that and see if they need to have things stand up. What can you do to support that? Because too often there's an expectation for Aboriginal people to be in a group or go to a meeting or be on a board when sometimes they've got their own little pet projects they want to get up running. They need people to come and help support and give that legs to move, So that would be one thing I could see.
Yes, sorry, I didn't answer your question. One sort of tip it's an old tip, old faithful. If you're in a room talking as a leadership group about country and you start talking about Indigenous aspects, Aboriginal peoples, Wurundjeri issues, stop and just get them in the room with you. Make sure that they're in the room with you when you're talking about country. So I suppose it's having the courage to pull up, step back a bit and allow them to enter the space and talk about their river. I think that's a challenge that we find that, I think what's the saying, nothing about us without us. That sort of saying is that, we're never in the room, we're never in the building, we're never on the same street as when decisions are made. I think there's scope for that, but also flipping if there's any research done, flip the research paradigm, because we're Aboriginal people, some of the most researched on the planet. How can research help Aboriginal people? So when you start thinking about a research project, start early, start engaging the traditional owners. What are the questions they want answered? What can research and science and policy do for them? How can their questions be answered rather than research having the question determined and you going out and saying, oh, I've got a question, can you help me answer it? Yeah, so I suppose it's thinking differently as well. And I think that's coming. I just wrote just published at 5:06 a.m. on Sunday morning, talking about Indigenous research methodologies, and that's a whole new space for me. But when I started thinking about it, it's just how you think and how the ways of ways of knowing and being Aboriginal compared to ways of like adaptive management has a learning by doing, but Indigenous think by the way we are, the way we do things, the way we think, the way we connect, and how can we build them together? Adaptive management could be a key part of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And I think there's opportunities for that. And I thought, well, I worked for CSIRO back in the day, and I couldn't. Through scientific research, I couldn't reference my traditional knowledge because there was no reference point. So how can we flip that? You might have to publish in a lower ranked journal to get your knowledge in there. Then you can reference it. And I think how can we do things differently? And I think it's also up to us as well to enter that space and be that voice. And you talked about burnout and when you're the only Aboriginal person in an organisation, you become the black inbox. You're it. You're it. You know, all the troubles, so-and-so had an issue with, what Adam Goods did. Yeah, flick it over to the Aboriginal officer. Yeah. And, I think those sort of things, the burnout, the challenges of always, and my motto is you always turn up. There was a call at 9:15, I was here at 9:17, so I was a bit late. But always turn up. But the thing is, sometimes you're just too tired. And I don't have a very good no muscle, but Erin was nice enough to ask me, and I couldn't say no. But the opportunity to sit on a boat on Parramatta River and just talk, how could I say no to this?
Yeah, Leah.
But one thing I found quite interesting in sort of having informal conversations with all speakers across both days, and also yourself and Alessandro, is just, us talking about different rivers that have been granted varying degrees of self-autonomy or legal rights, and yourself as the Birrarung Council sort of being a collective caretaker for the Birrarung. And then you have the Wanganui, which is quite a different type of legislative change that sort of acknowledges that water as being self-autonomous. This whole new world of personhood and rivers is very new to me. But given that we're situated right here, right now, what are the aims for this water that we're sitting on? Is it that we want this Parramatta River to be self-autonomous in this kind of more Wanganui type scenario, or is it that the ultimate is kind of talking about who has the say, you know what I mean? It is a difficult kind of thing to be thinking with the river as opposed to thinking for or communicating for the river, like that with and for it is a very kind of powerful moment of transition in how we think about the ways of bringing that river into dialogue and into conversation and what it enables for that river as well. So I guess in terms of future thinking, what is it that we want for this water that we're on at the moment?
I think the people who are using the river and those industries that are around the river need to be held accountable. Straight up, that needs to be almost like like some sort of programming, going in there, educational programming of how to be responsible, river dwellers. Because too often it's such an easy fix, just throw it in a drain, and we're still finding that even today that's still going on. That would be a really big start, I think. I don't know if that's even done. I know they've got environmental protection measures and all that, but how much is that implemented? How much is that reinforced? How much is it updated? I don't know. But that would be a start for me, because especially here, and we're looking at, as we're moving around on the boat, I'm just seeing all this, every little pockets of green, and then all this industry around, and you just think, wow, I hope those people are being responsible, because they're right on the river's edge, and there is life still moving through these waters, so I think that would be a start that I could see.
Yeah, I suppose it's also learning too from other experiences. Like the Birrarung Act is one of the first in the country to sort of give the river its own legislation to exist as a river and have people manage its existence and get it back to life. And I think we've had 234 years of doing it wrong. We might need a 234-year recovery plan to fix it. How can Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of the Parramatta River, be part of that? Making sure that they have a seat at the table every time when decisions are made. Like the Birrarung Council. That those elders and those families that have connection to that river are part of the decision making. And I sort of said before that we're always on advisory groups, and that's great advice, but we won't take it. And I think there's that sort of has to change as well. And part of it is up to us too. To fill that void and be in those spaces where they're provided. And the part of it is on Aboriginal people to be part of that as well. So there's a two-way aspect as part of that knowledge that we're coming to the table with knowledge, experience, observation, stories, connections, and then the Western science, like just Iron Cove Bay, we're just past Iron Cove Bridge. I remember doing uni sampling the river, and the amount of metals and toxic stuff that was coming up from the soil samples, just in the bay, like that sort of stuff is the previous use. How can we get back to some way where a river is healthy? What is a goal? I think Parramatta Lake had something like become swimmable or something like that, and the Birrarung might have. And then Birrarung has something too, like swimmable, and like my elders go to the river and they've got to take bottled water, but they used to drink that river water. So.
I am just going to cheekily ask Nadia to come up and just talk a little bit about the master plan for the Parramatta.
Hi, my name's Nadia. I'm representing the Parramatta River Catchment Group here today. And firstly, I just want to thank the people from the Biennale for arranging this awesome event and putting a spotlight on the Parramatta River. It's just awesome timing, particularly, and also to thank Leanne and Brad for your awesome stories and input and personal reflections about the river. I really appreciate that. So excited. The timing's so awesome for this because for the last 10 years, the Parramatta River Catchment Group has been working on the development of our master plan to basically make the river swimmable again by 2025. And our mission is to make the river our living river. It's at the heart of everything we do. And that's everything from, as I was saying before, the unsexy stuff like improving stormwater infrastructure, reducing stormwater runoff, and a whole bunch of other things around that, bringing back wildlife and biodiversity to the river, obviously to maintain the swim sites that we do have and also create new ones. And in fact, we'll be opening a new swim site in Concord, Bayview Park, in September of this year, which is just awesome. So we're ahead of schedule. But a very important part of our master plan is to improve the governance around the river, and particularly Aboriginal governance of the river, to really increase that, to invite Aboriginal people to join us in joint decision making and joint governance of the river in a really meaningful, sustainable way. And so the timing of the Biennale and the conversations around legal personhood for the river, and to create a pact with the river that the community can sign and pledge their enduring care and custodianship of the river, I think is just such an important part of our project. So thank you very much for all the work you guys are doing around this space. But yeah, it's been an awesome project. It's an alliance of local and state government agencies in the community, so more than 35 different organisations that have been working really, really hard behind the scenes to improve water quality and all other aspects of waterway management. And we're getting there. Like on a good day, not at the moment because of the unfortunate the weather that we've been having and the stormwater runoff that is currently still in the water. The water quality is not that great, but on a good day, the water quality downriver particularly is good enough to swim in. But we're working every day to improve that. And so yeah, it's an awesome project, and we're glad for the Biennale support in that. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to offer our panellists a couple of closing remarks, and then we'll have to wrap up for the day. But thank you to everyone who's been part of this, and most particularly to our amazing speakers, Leanne and Brad. And final remarks.
I just wanted to follow on that, because thinking about like the Birrarung, that's just normal saying it. It's getting to a point where it's normal saying it. That's fantastic. So the renaming of places that have its original name, like I remember talking at a Cooks River symposium, and it was like hashtag change the name. Like that's the first start. There's a lot of hurt in that name, and I suppose it's changed. Could change. I think the Macquarie just had its name changed to its traditional name by the Wiradjuri. So things, little steps like that are positive. Yeah, and they can be huge. And I think, we've seen it with major landmarks like Uluru and Karajuta and all those sort of places. And, Boobra Lagoon still got its original name. And, I think there's opportunity for that as well. But just wrapping up, it's been an honour. I thought it was the biennial, not the biennale. I'm thinking biennial, that's twice a year, cool. But I'm thinking, what's this biennale? Sounds posh. It is. But yeah, I just want to thank the organisers and obviously sitting alongside this amazing woman and talking. And I think we've value added to each other. It's been great yarning with everyone, and we're sort of in a semicircle, so it's nice too. And I think that's the circle is the key part of that. And, I think what I'd like to see is that, you seek out an Indigenous fire and get asked to join that fire and sit at that fire, to listen to the stories. And that's why you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. You got to do the double listening to talking. And then when you're listening and Aboriginal people are talking, the voices of that yarning goes up to the ancestors in the sky, in the smoke.
Fantastic. No, I really agree with that. That was awesome. I also want to extend my thanks to all the organisers, but also the Biennale in itself for giving me a chance to put my voice as a Darug person, because we've been silent or silenced for a very long time, denied existence even, and haven't yet had a chance to sit down and talk with people who are making decisions about our land, selling it off here and there. And I would really welcome that opportunity for the local Aboriginal land councils to actually acknowledge Darug, that we exist, that we are here. We're not going away, we're getting stronger, our voices are getting stronger, our language is coming back, and our role as custodians of country is stronger than ever. And that is always going to be the underlying linchpin for me. That's never going to waver. So I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity. Didgeridoo.
Thank you again, both of you, and thank you to everyone. And I really hope that today is something you can carry with you, that you can go and spend time with your rivers and your water landscapes and consider the relationship that you have with them, the kind of conversations that you would like to have with them. This event is coming to a close now. We're going to be heading back to the wharf, but it continues tomorrow. So I hope many of you will be joining us for more conversations with more amazing speakers tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. So thank you again. I think we'll have to wrap up, but please come and talk to us if you've got any other questions or any other thoughts you'd like to share. So thank you again, everyone. I hope you've had a wonderful time.